You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Archaeotech Podcast, episode 20. I'm your host, Chris Webster, with my co-host, Chris Sims. On today's show, we interviewed Jack Berry, a Mayan archaeologist that used LIDAR extensively on Mayan sites in Belize. We'll talk to him about remote sensing and some other techniques he's used. Let's get to it. All right, welcome to the show, everyone. Joining me, as always, is my co-host, Chris Sims.
Hi, and we're going to go ahead and get to the show. Today we've got Jack Berry joining us. Jack and I were colleagues in Belize several years ago, and it's been really cool to keep up with him and hear about the research he's been doing. Jack, thanks for joining us today and taking some time out of your travels to chat with us on the Archaeotech Podcast. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've been up to?
Well, thanks for having me on the show, guys. As Chris said, we worked in Belize together, I think maybe as far back as 2009, so it has been a while. I have a master's degree in archaeology from Trent University in Ontario, and some of the things that I do while focusing on the Maya include specializing in GIS, and recently we've incorporated a little bit of LIDAR technology too, so a little bit more on the technical side of things. And then when I'm not in Belize, I've done a bunch of CRM too here in Ontario and as well in the States.
So I got a question. What made you want to get into remote sensing in the areas that you work? Like what kicked that whole thing off for you?
Well, it's interesting because the region we work in, which is sort of west central Belize, along the Guatemalan border, is really a rugged landscape. And so the work that we were doing was focusing on a couple of sites that have been known for a long time, but because it's a really rugged area, it doesn't lend itself very well to surface surveying. So we know that in this area there must be tons of other sites out there, but we just don't know exactly where they are. So in a sense, the area lends itself, the landscape and the tree cover and the vegetation lend itself very nicely to remote sensing as a way to look at trying to figure out where other sites are, things like that, because it's just simply so hard to get around on foot.
Did you guys rely on, have Mayanists in the past relied on just trekking through the jungle or accounts from indigenous people there to find sites in the past?
Well, yeah, it's one of those ones where the region has been worked in by archaeologists for over a century, basically at this point, but very few sites, and so it has been a lot of on foot with horseback, mule trains, bringing in supplies, machetes, all that stuff, just trying to get to the few sites that we're known about. And then interestingly, the area is also still farmed by modern people. And so there are lots of guys in the region that when you go talk to them will tell you about sites. Oh, I know of a site over there, or you should come see this one. And it's funny because by definition, sites can vary, as most people in archaeology will attest to. So when they might be talking about a site, it could be a single mound, but rarely you actually get some big monumental architecture and epicenters and things like that. So it has been primarily on foot, hacking through the bush, machetes, and having guys that live in the area as guides and use a lot of the trails for hunting and things like that is invaluable.
Nice. Do you guys primarily use, say, mostly one technique for remote sensing like LIDAR, or is it a whole suite of things that you use in different, say, percentages? I don't know how to phrase that.
Mm-hmm. Well, we had some satellite imagery, a combination of things to create a basic elevation map for the region. Those came from 2 or 3 different satellites in different bandwidths and bands, infrared, near infrared, things like that. And then LIDAR was actually just, we acquired that data, my supervisor and the project manager and principal investigator, Giles Ainoni, he and a big consortium of people across Western Belize got a huge flight. They did a huge, like 900 hours or something like that of LIDAR and did an area of over 1,200 square kilometers.
Oh my God.
So that was done in 2013. and it covers a massive area of West Central Belize. And one of the hopes with this sort of collaborative grant to do that is it actually puts together one of the largest patches of contiguous LIDAR data basically anywhere as far as archaeology goes. So it's a pretty unique opportunity and something very cool to have been a little bit of a part of.
Yeah. Now, 2013 is getting real close to when, the discussion was going to lead to this, but getting real close to when drones, hand operated drones, were starting to fly LIDAR units. Do you think, looking back on it, that was a better deal? I guess especially if you got a grant to pay for it, but if that was a better deal financially, really, than doing, I guess, smaller areas with smaller equipment, say drones, rather than, because I'm assuming when you guys had that big survey done, it was on a large aircraft with a mounted LIDAR unit.
Yeah, I think it was. Not a real big aircraft. I think it's just sort of
Yeah.
a little Cessna light airplane
Oh,
or something. But yeah, it was
bigger than a
mounted
drone
with.
anyway.
Yes, exactly. But it's one of those ones, and with LIDAR, it's sort of what your research goal is and what sort of area you're looking to cover. I think those drones can probably be. I've never worked with one personally, but I know that they can be really helpful if you're looking at a small area, because I think with those, the real the ticket is that the operator with the remote control can't really be that far away from it. So obviously, if you have a sort of circumscribed area, a particular site, or just something that you want to have your LiDAR cover, you can do those drones. And I think that's pretty useful because, like you said, the cost is the real backbreaker with this type of technology. I think that cost should be coming down over time, but those drones definitely sort of bring it down to the level where most projects can afford something like that if they want to, as opposed to these massive flyovers where it's costing, hundreds of thousands of dollars and, tons of man hours and all that stuff. So I guess it's one of those ones where you just kind of have to, it's what your research sort of dictates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know a company like Archaeology is making drone units that will specifically hold LIDAR units and some other remote sensing techniques. And I know their drones go for a couple $1,000s for their bigger ones that can handle most wind conditions and payloads.
Mm.
I don't know how much the LIDAR add-on costs, but to own your own setup for a few $1,000s seems pretty reasonable. Before we get too far into this, we probably should ask you this first. For the audience members that don't know, can you define LIDAR and what it is when we say you're looking at a LIDAR image? Like, what are you getting back? What is that telling you?
Sure, absolutely. LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging. So it's just LiDAR is, I guess, a shortened version of that, condensed into one simple to use word. But basically, the way I sort of like to describe it, and this is maybe a little bit vanilla, but it's sort of getting like an X-ray vision shot, like Superman's X-ray vision,
Nice.
onto
Nice.
what's on the ground. And the real benefit of something like LiDAR is for an area that is heavily forested or covered where you can't see through that stuff. So that's why we sort of, obviously if you're in a arid environment or somewhere with less vegetation, you're not seeing through anything necessarily, but what it's returning to you in either case is an elevation model that shows the contours of the ground below. And because of that, you can then identify archaeological features such as buildings, whether some small, some large, and get a picture of what's there without actually having to set foot on the ground, and that's the real advantage.
Okay. Yeah, because it sees through most vegetation, right?
Yeah, the technology is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
With different filters and processing methods, you can eliminate an enormous amount of vegetation where, if you were to pull up a Google map of Western Belize, all you see is just sort of a homogeneous green, tree top view. There's no contour on the ground below for the most part, and you don't appreciate or understand how maybe hilly or rugged it is. But then all of a sudden you get this 3D LiDAR data back that it just, you see, it's hard to imagine that that's all underneath there. So it's pretty remarkable that you can remove all those different tree covers and things like that.
Nice.
Okay, so Jack, you had mentioned some of the other methods in remote sensing. Do any of those come anywhere near as close to LIDAR in terms of detecting sites with any good accuracy?
With any good accuracy, no. LiDAR's pretty unique in its ability to detect things where things like aerial imagery and other satellite imagery have sort of failed for a whole number of reasons. But people have tried to look at different types of aerial footage and remote sensing techniques with infrared and different types of angled lighting to understand what's underneath, especially in vegetated areas. But the simple answer is absolutely not. LiDAR blows that all out of the water.
Nice. And I've seen, I remember your poster at the SAAs in Austin a couple years ago, where you had explained about how LiDAR works in terms of generating like a point cloud from the aerial unit, and then you strip the point cloud off, and that's all of the jungle, and then you've got, the digital elevation model that you had mentioned earlier. Um, are there any ways to combine the point cloud of the jungle with other methods? Like I think you had mentioned detecting different types of vegetation.
Yeah, so technically speaking, LiDAR is there's that could be a podcast on its own, but essentially what you're getting with, as you said, the point cloud. So when the plane is flying over, it's shooting down uh, pulses from a laser, basically, at millions of times per second. So it's then the device is actually listening for those pulses to actually come back up and record them. So one pulse may actually go all the way through and you'll get multiple returns on it. So you'll get returns from when it hits the top of the tree canopy. Then you might get a return from where it's running into some interference sort of in the middle of the tree canopy. And then you'll get it again from the ground level. So with all kinds of different post processing with that data, you can essentially boil it down to whatever, again, what your research dictates. If you're looking at tree cover and you want to know things like that, or how tall trees are, you can obviously learn those things. As far as in the different types of vegetation, I'm not sure that that's exactly the right tool for it, as opposed to other heat based imagery or different infrared types of sensors. Um, but yeah, so you can really have a lot of options with what you want to do with that point cloud data, and that's a field that I'm not terribly involved in, is actually the processing of that data, but I know it's very technical and it's pretty powerful.
All right, so maybe you can answer this question for me, because I've been wondering how LIDAR does this, but most of the archaeological images you see associated with LIDAR are just terrain. All the vegetation has been removed, and mostly they're gray too, and I feel like you can probably lay some photogrammetry on top of that if you really wanted to. But anyway, um, I've been wondering how it eliminates the vegetation, and it sounds like you just explained that. And I think it's probably the narrow focused beam, like the laser, the light that it's using, like you said, can get the tops of trees, but it also gets like in the point right next to that, it might be shooting all the way through and hitting the ground. And with post processing, you just acknowledge the ones that are impacting the ground or harder structures that aren't vegetation, would be my guess. But then if that's the case, how do you tell it? How do you tell your post processing to differentiate between, say, even like wooden structures, or maybe it's just stone structures and features versus really dense trees and things like that? Do you know how that's done, or am I off the mark on this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, because it's elevation based, and it's going to return uh, different elevations based on what it's hitting. Uh, what it has to be anchored to is an actual fixed GPS point on the ground that gives you a ground level elevation. So before you get in the airplane and send it flying all over the place, there has to be sort of a benchmark on the ground that then you use to look at the rest of the data that it's giving you, and from there build the model based off of the one fixed point that's from somebody actually going on the ground and recording an elevation.
So Jack, with the results of the LiDAR scans, do you have like false positives that need to be ground truthed with people in the field? or even like false negatives that you can kind of reconcile against surveys?
Yeah, there's always anomalies sort of in the data, and those can come from any number of different things. And sometimes that can even be things like if you have a zinc roof on your house, it might return a very obscure elevation because of the glare, something like that. And so different surfaces will have different effects on the data that's being recorded. Um, things like water, ice can have very different effects on it. Um, but as far as false negatives and positives, that's sort of more of a question of what are you trying to identify or what are you looking at? So while you, in terms of archaeology, you might see something that looks like a big mound and think it's some sort of architecture. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is always. Those are the things that end up needing to be ground truth because what all that it is a model.
Cool. So again, with the results of this, have the scans that you've worked with in Belize, has it changed kind of the research questions that you're dealing with? So like me being familiar with pedestrian survey in Belize, I know that the earlier days of survey in Belize focused primarily on like monumental sites, and only recently, in recent decades, has the focus shifted toward like household and like non-elite archaeology. Is the result of LIDAR data also changing kind of your focus there?
Oh, yeah, that's a really interesting question. Sort of in one sense, because LIDAR is very fresh and new, especially in that region, there's not a lot of precedent for it. So it's more, a lot of the questions are more so about acquiring the data and then sort of seeing what you've got. But as you mentioned, there's been sort of a focus for the last probably 20 years or so, shifting towards household and community archaeology, trying to understand what the people living outside of the monumental site cores were up to, how they were organized, and things like that, because basically that is about 98% of your population is people not living in the royal residential palaces and courtyards and things like that. So with the LIDAR, it does have a very fine resolution. It's a lot of times you can get 1 meter or sub 1 meter resolution.
Wow.
There's the sort of, as far as architecture goes, the households that a lot of these common people were living in are very small mounds, sometimes not even a meter, a lot of times not even a meter, if you can see them at all. So with LIDAR, you can identify some of those, but in a lot of different studies, some of the colleagues that I worked with, that those were their research questions of what can you identify based on just a LIDAR, doing a blind test, and then comparing it to what you know with ground-based survey. And a lot of the time, what you're seeing is that just based on the LIDAR alone, it's not nearly high enough accuracy to represent all of the structures on the ground. You still cannot replace LIDAR with, or sorry, you cannot replace ground-based survey with LIDAR alone. There has to be, they have to work in conjunction.
Gotcha.
Are you sure that's not just a little job security talk in there, Jack?
You know what? Yeah, right. Yeah, so there still is a place for surveyors in the world. They're not going to be losing their jobs anytime soon, which I know guys like Chris, you appreciate that.
Yeah.
Nice. All right. Well, the audience may not know this, but we have had some Skype issues, and I'm not sure where we are in our timing. So we're going to take a quick break right now, and we'll come back with the next segment in a minute.
Whether you're an undergraduate majoring in archaeology or a field tech that's wondering where to go next, the Go Dig a Hole podcast is for you. A new series on the Archaeology Podcast Network. Hosts Christopher and Andy answer a wide range of questions from those new to the field, with help from CRM, academic, and public sector archaeologists. This show is a companion to the blog godigahole.com and tackles questions from readers and listeners to provide a toolkit aimed to help you get a leg up in the competitive field of archaeology. Subscribe to the show via the Archaeology Podcast Network, iTunes, or wherever you get podcasts.
All right, we're back. And following up with what we were talking about in the last segment, you were mentioning how your research goals are changing and things like that, but that you still have to do pedestrian survey. But what I'm wondering is, has the nature of that pedestrian survey changed? For example, do you do like targeted survey, go into LIDAR anomalies, or do you widen out your survey because LIDAR, kind of caught most of it, sort of thing? Or has that changed how you guys do stuff on the ground?
Well, yeah, that's a really interesting question, and again, it's one of those ones where, because it is a fairly new application of this technology, at least in the part of the world in Belize where I've been working, that's the next step. So now that we've had this enormous LIDAR coverage, we can actually see a bunch of new sites. We've identified all kinds of new places. It will absolutely change the way surveying on the ground is done, because traditionally, you have people either walking transects or doing full coverage survey of a specified area. Well, now, yeah, as you mentioned, you can absolutely do targeted survey, and that can be also catered to what type of research you're interested in. So whether you want to get on the ground in that area and try to count as many house mounds as you can, or if you've found a new monumental epicenter, you can hop in the Jeep and follow a point and see if you can get to that spot, and then from there, develop all kinds of different surveying techniques and see what's going on. But yeah, absolutely. Now, rather than just sending people off, if we're looking for new sites, rather than sending people off on walkabout or trying to talk to locals and get a sense of where sites are, now we've seen them on the LIDAR data, but we actually know where they are now. So you can do targeted survey that way, for sure.
It's still kind of amazing to me that, you said they've been doing archaeology out there for at least 100 years, and people have been walking all over that place. It's not like it's unexplored country, and yet you're still optimistic that you can find a monumental epicenter using LIDAR data. That's just kind of floors me that stuff like that is still out there and able to be found in that area. I guess that tells you how much cover is over the top of it, huh?
Yeah, there was an area that we worked in. There was about 200 square kilometers, and in that area we had what we were calling 4 major centers, and then a whole host of minor centers. Well, with the new LIDAR, we've added another close to 12 major centers in this area, so it's gone up considerably.
Wow.
And those are all sites that are as yet unnamed, things like that. So it was pretty revealing and striking that in an area that we thought maybe one of these major centers, and by that those are loaded terms, absolutely loaded terms, but where these major centers, which are sort of the big monumental epicenters that have political seats for religious, semi-religious kings, divine kingship, things like that. Public architecture, sort of what you would typically think of when you think of maybe something like Tikal or Chichen Itza, whatever, not on that same size scale, but that there are many more of them out there in a small area. So they were neighbors with one another, and then it's absolutely new information for us.
Since I don't really know a lot about Mayan archaeology, fill me in real quick, and maybe some other people have this question too. I'm wondering, when you say they were neighbors, they're physically neighbors, but temporally, do you think a lot of these places you're finding were occupied around the same time period? It sounds like it was relatively more crowded than we kind of thought it was.
Well, yeah, that's a fantastic question, and absolutely one of the ones that, when you're using some technology kind of like LIDAR, it's imperative that you're aware of stuff like that, because just because they're there on the ground not too far away from one another absolutely does not imply that they were contemporaneous with one another. So that is why, again, you have to have your coupled LIDAR with pedestrian type of survey, and that's why you also absolutely need to do excavation as well before you can make any type of claim of whether these are truly neighbors, meaning occupied at the same time, or whether they had very, very different political and historical trajectories.
Are there stylistic or architectural differences you can point out in the LIDAR data?
So far, nothing that you can identify, you know, with very much confidence.
Right.
There's not, at least in the Maya area, there's not any major type of form in architecture that you could see on a macro scale. There are much smaller intricacies within architecture that will give you those that information. But at least through the LIDAR, no, because again, all these buildings are covered by heaps of dirt and trees, and they've all been chewed up. So that's when you need on the ground excavations, getting in and doing the dirty work to actually get any real information out of it.
Yeah, and it's amazing how much excavation it takes to actually reveal the final phase of architecture on some of that monumental architecture, because even when you do identify the stones that formed that structure, a lot of it has collapsed, and so you've got like a rubble of stones that's covering the final phase of architecture. And then even above that rubble, like you said, Jack, the jungle just reclaims it so quickly.
I'm wondering about mixing a few technologies. First off, before I say that, I just had a comment on finding some of this new stuff. It's got to take weeks just to clear the vegetation off of some of these things.
Oh, man, yeah.
Let alone excavation.
Years.
Yeah.
Right.
So, one thing I was thinking of, we interviewed on our last episode 19, Bernard Beans. And one thing he said, and I'm always trying to find a way to meld two different technologies and things that might not seem like they go together. But one of the things he said they've done is we had a question from somebody that said, do you have the resolution to scan individual like pottery sherds and then refit them back together? And he said, yeah, not only can we do that, but you can scan the individual sherds, digitally put them back together, fill in the blanks if you've got missing pieces, and then print a whole vessel rather than just print pieces of it and then put it together like that. You can actually digitally put it together and then print the entire vessel. So I'm wondering, with laser scanning on some of these these architecture, if you could scan, say, pieces of it, walls and distinct pieces where you can maybe get most of the way around it, or at least enough way around it to produce something. And then you could almost 3D print these at 1/20th the scale or something like that, and just kind of play with it and put it back together. And if they're crumbled down into pieces, maybe you can pull these things back together like that and put the puzzle back together. Do you think that would have any applicability down there, or am I totally pie in the sky on this one?
Well, no, I think 3D printing and using technologies like that to create models you can actually have in your hands and tangible is a very attractive avenue for archaeology, and especially with scanning, the ability to maybe scan and study artifacts, where in a place like Belize, most of the researchers down there are coming from North America or even overseas, but you have to go through a whole series of hoops to export artifacts because they're the cultural heritage of the country of Belize. So they own that material. So you have to go through all these permits and formal requests if you want to export anything to study it later. So if you don't have a ton of time in the field to do those studies, something like 3D printing, I think, is an amazingly attractive opportunity to be able to, whether it's stone tools, whether it's ceramics, whether it's even, why not something like architecture? You might, absolutely. I haven't seen it, but that doesn't mean it's not an excellent idea or that somebody wouldn't be able to find it extremely useful.
Well, the thing I like about it too, and I've thought about this for CRM archaeology, and it was especially for work for you guys when you're out there for a well-defined field season, is that you could scan something in the field, and then if you have the ability to upload that scan or send it off to somebody somewhere else in the country, another Mayan expert that you're familiar with can, when we get to this stage in our careers and our scientific abilities, they can download that scan and print it off in their office or their lab, and then take a look exactly what you're talking about while you're still in the field. I mean, that would be phenomenal.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think of things like lithics and ceramics where, you might not be a ceramic expert, but if you had the ability to either scan something and with, digital photography, all the colors and the textures and things like that are pretty well represented. And then to be able to send it off to to somebody in a lab or who's not there, and they could give you their opinion, things like that. I think that would be amazing.
For sure, for sure.
Yeah. I'm also thinking about, the implications of these different technologies with LIDAR and also with 3D scanning and printing and imaging and all that. I'm thinking about the implications that these have for, funding a project, and then how far you can stretch the funding for these projects. Like you've got already, instead of spending years and years surveying an area, you've got a flyover that, yeah, it's expensive, but when you think about the cost of years and years of survey, would you say, Jack, that that's a better payout?
There's no question. I mean, it would be absolutely impossible to send a ground survey team to cover that same, whether it's just the area that I'm working in directly, 200 square kilometers, or the area that was surveyed in total with the LIDAR, which was about 1,200 square kilometers. That is absolutely impossible with a ground crew. And with LIDAR, obviously, it provides a pretty good starting point to then tailor research and come up with questions appropriate that you're seeing from the LIDAR models. So absolutely, if you can afford it, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
If that's what your research goals are too, is to understand, everything that's in that area. I think from most archaeologist perspectives, you want to know what's out there because, people were influencing one another, and how are they interacting with one another? What did their community look like? How many people? And just, even simple things like that. With LIDAR, you can start to paint a picture with those models. But again, it still goes back to, you have to put people on the ground to then go do the dirty work, so to speak.
Always goes back to job security. Always
Absolutely.
goes back to it. Yeah. So I'm wondering, what other sorts of remote sensing techniques do you guys use on a regular basis down there?
Frankly,
if any.
Frankly, not too many. I mean, there still are people using satellite imagery to build models and elevation models, things like that. But as far as remote sensing, there's not too many other options. Again, you find that even getting satellite imagery is expensive. So the cost of that is still significantly less than LIDAR, but what you see now is people who are trying to use drones and find less expensive ways to get that LIDAR data, just because it's so much better with what you can see and do with it. If you're trying to expose the surface and find out where you have structures and the size of a community or something like that. I guess it just goes back to what your research goals are too. But yeah, satellites and LIDAR, that's pretty much the extent of a lot of the remote sensing that I'm familiar with anyway.
I guess mostly you do direct sensing with a shovel and a trowel.
Yeah, exactly. That feels like a stone to me.
Yeah.
Right. Nice. All right. Chris, do you have anything else on LIDAR?
Not really. I keep thinking back to our conversation with Bernard Means on our last episode of the Archaeotech podcast, where he was talking about how he walks around with 3D prints of stuff, and I just had the funny idea of him walking around with a miniature version of one of the sites you're working on, just hanging out in his pocket, and he just lays it out on a conference table.
Some kind of temple. No, he won't lay it on a conference table. He'll lay it on a table like Starbucks and then take a selfie. That's what Bernard does.
They in Belize, the first site that had a major LIDAR coverage was the site of Caracol, just sort of in central Belize, south central Belize. And they did print a 3D model of it. And that, if you've ever been to a site like Tikal, I imagine most very large archaeological sites, and a lot of them around the world, if you go and you start at sort of like a museum in the beginning, a lot of them will have models built up, that somebody sat down with a tiny little brush and painted all kinds of little things on there. But again, sort of with modern technology and 3D printing, once you have that LIDAR image, you can print everything from, the whole area that it covered down to, individual house mounds and little groups and things like that. So I know that Dr. Arlen Chase has a 3D model of sort of the monumental epicenter of Caracol. So that would be pretty cool.
Nice.
Yeah.
That would be cool. Cool. All right. Well, I had a question related to the satellite imagery. You mentioned how it's getting expensive, but I've heard a lot of people really, for some stuff, really just using, especially for bigger things, just Google satellite images. In fact, some of the other satellite image repositories I've heard of have actually dropped fees on their stuff, like some of the government ones, because nobody's using them anymore. They're just going to Google Earth and using those data and I know of some people, like in Africa and Australia and things like that are just like, it's their job to pore over, as an archaeologist, to pore over satellite data and just look for things that look out of the ordinary that haven't been discovered yet. Would that be all that effective down where you're at because of the vegetation cover and the forest cover and things like that? Or do you need like super awesome satellite coverage just to be able to see anything?
Yeah, the vegetation poses the biggest limitation. But actually, there have been some pretty interesting studies of not even necessarily archaeologists, but people who are working with archaeologists and collecting different types of satellite imagery to study things like the paths where people are moving illegal drugs and border activity based on things like infrared lighting and where paths are sort of, even if you can't see them that well underneath or on something like a Google Maps with different infrared lighting, you can actually start to see things like trails where across a porous border, things like that, or even different types of vegetation that might indicate, at least in Belize, where you find a lot of these sites that have been reclaimed by the jungle. There are different types of vegetation that prefer to grow on limestone, which is the material that Maya used to build their structures with. So you have a little bit different vegetation signatures there. There's a lot of different implications for things like that.
Yeah, and I'm thinking as you're saying that, remind me, during your poster, weren't you dealing with least cost paths between sites?
Yeah, one of the things that was kind of funny while I was in grad school doing my research, that was while the LIDAR was being collected. So I didn't have access to it until afterwards. So my MA thesis work was kind of ironically trying to sort of run a predictive model of where we think sites might be based on characteristics of known sites. Well, interestingly enough, we were using Viewshed. I was using Viewshed and cost path analyses to look at things like that and try to understand where people would put other large sites. And then I spent an entire summer in 2012, I think it was 2012, with a Belizean guide in a rusty old pickup truck and our machetes with a list of GPS points where I said, we think sites are going to be at these spots, and going and trying to ground truth that. Well, that was an enormous undertaking that it sounds pretty straightforward, but I think I could be a mechanic at a garage just from having to, even just work on this truck that is not suited for, going around such a rugged area. But we found some sites that was really cool. It was rewarding to do that. But then the following year, once we got this LIDAR data, it was almost like a slap in the face that, we revealed so much more in a couple hours of an airplane flying over that I had just spent, an entire summer running up and down mountains and, chopping snakes in half and just sort of some pretty interesting and hairy stuff that I don't know, I guess Chris, you as a surveyor can appreciate, but yeah, the LIDAR absolutely blew it out of the water. And so we have, again, different research questions and different ways of looking at it.
That's amazing. But I mean, I think that's a testament to, like how important it is to have multiple modes of detection and research. That, you were out there toughing it out, and then LIDAR came and confirmed what you had found through a different method.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because we've joked about job security, and there is no replacing good old-fashioned archaeology, in a sense. And so with all these technologies, it's sort of the, blessing and a curse that we have them all, because people will inevitably apply them improperly. But anybody who does archaeology or research, hopefully is well aware to be critical of, what you're reading and things like that. And just because somebody has published something, or maybe wrote a book or whatever it might be, giving a talk or a paper or a poster, doesn't necessarily mean they've used those technologies appropriately. So that's the balance of trying to, take those specific tools, whether it's LIDAR, satellite imagery, even things like ground survey, and then, produce some data and be objective about it. And they all go hand in hand, and hope, the goal is to try to use them appropriately all together where it works.
Yeah.
So I'll finish this up following just on a couple things you said, Jack. I've been looking at doing, setting up a research design to use drones out here in the Western United States for some survey, because it sounds like can happen where you're at too. I mean, you can survey a big area and find absolutely nothing, and then you find this one amazing thing that maybe you could have just walked right to with the LIDAR data or something like that, and then do the archaeology, at that site, or maybe widen out your transect intervals with the LIDAR data, stuff like that. Change your research methodology a little bit. It's not only just for me, it's not just to, I would say, save money or something like that. It's really so we can spend more time doing the archaeology, spend more time doing the science rather than, it's nice to hike in the desert sometimes. We had a 30,000 acre project where we will have recorded probably 250 sites by the time it's all said and done. So that 250 sites takes up like 4% of that entire project area. And the rest of it was just walking amongst boulders and rattlesnakes and dealing with injuries and things like that. So if we'd had allocated that time differently, just like what you say you guys can possibly do down there, if we'd allocated that time differently, not only would it have been safer for people, but I feel like it allows you to get more done with the funding that you're given, rather than, I don't think there's a job security problem. There's plenty to find out there. There's plenty of archaeology to do. There's plenty of test units to dig and things like that. But if we can eliminate some of the needless survey, or survey that would become needless with technology, then it would be safer, and maybe we could focus on some of that other stuff. And maybe if you didn't have funding for doing, X analysis on your project, you would have that funding if you didn't have to spend the first 3 weeks doing survey. You know what I mean?
No, that's absolutely the name of the game, is using your time and money in the most effective way possible, depending on whatever it is you're looking at. So yeah, that's absolutely true. Where, one of the big benefits of LIDAR now is that you can do exactly that. If your research is trying to do some, you're excavating at a site and you don't know where that site is, if you can find it on a LIDAR model, then you can go straight to it, as opposed to, like you said, spending a ton of time, surveying on the ground and walking around. And that's, can for sure be looked at as a waste of resources almost.
Yeah. So we're going to wrap this up. Jack, thanks for coming on. Is there anything you wanted to say that, regarding LIDAR remote sensing that we didn't ask you, or that we didn't get to?
No, I think I sort of touched on it in sort of my last little question, where they're all very important technologies, but they have to be used properly and responsibly, and know when what you can say and what you can't say, and I guess just using them appropriately, like anything else.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Jack. It was good to have you on, and maybe after your next season out there, we'll have you on to talk about some of the things you guys found and stuff like that.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. I really appreciate it. That was fun.
All right, thank you. That's it for another episode of the Archaeotech Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archaeotech. If you like the show and want to comment, please do. You can leave comments about this or any other episode on the website or on the iTunes page for this episode. You can also email us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com or use the contact form on the podcast webpage. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website or tweet your questions with the hashtag Archaeotech or tag @ArchPodNet in your tweet. Please share the link to this show wherever you saw it. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, you can do so on iTunes or on Stitcher Radio. You can also type the name of the podcast into your favorite podcasting app and subscribe that way. Don't forget to go over to iTunes and leave a review of the show. It helps us get noticed so more people can find our podcast and benefit from the content. Also, send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about. This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.